Good morning, everybody. Oh, for goodness sake, we can do better than that. Good morning.
Good morning.
Right, Ángel Gurría of the OECD. We've got 20 minutes,
Okay.
which is barely time for you to brief us on the state of the global and the regional economy. But if we have to start with what is the single most important thing that these people need to understand about what's happening in the global economy at the moment?
I would say that, unfortunately, Professor Kaku's presentation is not where we have to be worried about, but by the billions and the billions that have not caught up, that are not enjoying the benefits, that are not sharing, at least not sharing fairly in the benefits of all this progress, by the fact that notwithstanding all these wonderful inventions that we have just been showed, we are at the lowest in terms of productivity growth, and also by the fact that after a 10-year crisis, it's been 10 years since the crisis, we're still suffering from low growth, from high unemployment, from growing inequalities, and from a very great crisis of the destruction of trust in presidents and prime ministers and ministers and political parties.
Who do you blame?
Well, the fact that we got it wrong when it was, first of all, because the crisis was, of course, in the financial sector, as Klaus Schwab just said. Then it became an economic crisis, then it became a social crisis, but then he said he skipped the part where it became a political crisis. And the fact that it became a political crisis is giving us some results today, like Brexit, or like 7 months in order to get a government in the Netherlands, or 5 months to get a government in Germany, etc.
Hang on. You went for Brexit? You went for the Netherlands?
I was against Brexit.
No, as an example there, you gave me Brexit.
Yes.
You gave me the Netherlands.
Yes.
You gave me Germany.
Yes.
You haven't given me Donald Trump.
That's another surprise.
As a result of all of this?
Yes, because the problem is that this anger is not just in the United States. Frustrated people is not just in the United States, and this happens all over the world. The question is, we left too many people outside the process. We left too many people there lingering on the side while there was a concentration of the wealth and the concentration of the benefits of modernity. And therefore, we are now suffering these consequences. We have to go back and take a hard look at how it is that we get them on the bandwagon so that we can have a fairer distribution of the wealth. And second,
you're sounding socialist.
Well, am I?
Yeah.
Well, basically, I think I'm sounding what I would call the balance between productivity and growth and inclusiveness. The link between the two is the only thing that will get us now in the next stage.
All right. So we screwed it up and got into the crisis. Leaders have screwed it up getting out of the crisis. Interest rates are now going back up again in many parts of the world. We're expecting growth to slow down in not to recessionary levels, but to slow down in many parts of the world. It seems to me that we've missed the opportunity for inclusive growth.
I don't think so. I think we still not only have a chance, but it's our only chance. Because if we miss the train again, we will have consequences on the political side, forget about the economic and the social side, which really we at this stage cannot even envisage. We are only starting to see the decomposition of politics, the increasing fragmentation of politics, which then leads to these very fragile coalitions where if the leader sneezes to the right, the people in the left get angry, they abandon the coalition, and then you have another election. And this, of course, speaks very badly about democracy, which people are abandoning. Why did we lose Brexit? Because 60% of the young people in Britain whose future was at stake did not believe that they should go and vote. It's not that they voted against or in favor of Brexit. They didn't go and vote, and their future was at stake. Why did we lose the referendum in Colombia? After 50 years of civil war, they voted against the peace. Why was it only 1/3 of the voters voted? Why? Because more dangerous than voting for change, voting against the government, whatever, is that the people no longer vote because they have lost the trust not only in governments, but also they have lost the trust in democracy. That is the greatest danger we have to face. We have to get back that trust.
How? Because you, for example, argue that we need to go back to multilateralism.
That is at stake. We took it for granted. We have been practicing multilateralism, building multilateralism, strengthening multilateralism.
Explain what it means, multilateralism.
That means that 1 + 1 is 5, and 1 + 1 + 1 is 25, because countries, when they act together, it's like when communities act together. This is, as old as, the Romans and the Greeks, who said that the union will make the force of course. And the question is that how can you deal today with things like climate change or trade or investment flows if you don't do it multilaterally? And the question is, a number of countries are promoting unilateralism, and I don't think we're being clear enough, strong enough, and we're not delivering and communicating enough how damaging this can be to the future of mankind.
Well, you say that, Secretary General, you say that. You're going to now tell me about the number of millions and hundreds of millions of people in the developed world that it's brought out of poverty. And I'm going to retort back to you, yes, but in doing that, it's also put a large number of people in the developed world into a more perilous economic state. And therefore, you have not made the case that multilateralism is the way forward.
I think I would agree with you that multilateralism has failed because we focused on the recovery side rather than on the inclusiveness side and on the link between the two. Today, we cannot only focus on the increase in productivity and growth, just like we cannot only focus on redistribution and the social side. It is the link between the two. It is things like more competition. It things like skilling, reskilling, upskilling in order to prepare most of the workforce for the digital revolution that Professor Kaku was telling us about.
How do you hope to get any form, and since this is the World Government Summit, let's put this in government terms. How do you hope to get any form of long-term planning when the average length of a minister is a matter of a few years? Here, what John Knott Sir Robin Day famously called, here today, gone tomorrow, politicians.
Well, elections are a fact of life. And of course, democracy, as was famously said by Mr. Churchill, is the worst form of government, with the exception of all the others. And therefore, we just have to keep practicing and making it better. But what we have to introduce in democracy is the medium and the long-term view, so that we can plan ahead, and that regardless of the changes in government, even regardless of the changes in the ideology of governments, then there are certain absolutely inevitable, irreversible needs that we have to pursue, and that those continue to be pursued regardless of the political changes and the governmental changes. Those are the things that we have to improve in our democracy. And this is, I was speaking to Boris Kravitnikov of Slovenia, who was saying, we have those pills that people can go in and, eat them in order to check our health in real time, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, governments are not doing that. They're not taking the pill, The governments are relatively static. They're a lot slower in moving and rolling with the punches. We have to get the governments to speed up and catch up with progress.
How? Governments are concerned about the next election. Let's take the United States, for example. You've had 2 government shutdowns in the space of this year, and it's only a month old. You've got a divided US Congress. You've got a budget deal or a tax deal that added 1.5 trillion to the deficit, and a budget deal, 2 years, that will add another 300 billion to the deficit.
Isn't it an excellent example of the kinds of things we shouldn't be doing, okay? Right.
But if the US is doing that, how on earth do you expect? If the US cannot even get a modicum of good governance, sophisticated governance, I'll grant you, but what might be described as good governance, how on earth do you expect developing nations to follow on?
Why do you suggest that if the US does it in a certain way, everybody else has to do it in a certain way, you know? Or that the
power of example.
That the US is the best example of how we should run governments. The question is, we know what is wrong in every single one of the governments, or what did not work in every single one of the governments. If the leaders identify those flaws and address them, they should be rewarded. If the leaders do not identify those flaws and do not address them, then they should be penalized and sanctioned by the vote. It's very simple. They will be voted out of office next time.
But that...
This is the power of the electorate.
No, you can't have your argument both ways. The power of the electorate to vote out at the next election engenders a short-termism of policy that enables you to buy elections with tax cuts rather than hard structural reform.
No, because you are condemning and you are accusing the electorate of being short-sighted.
They are!
Just as short-sighted as the politicians, and people are not. People are looking at the next generation. They have an intergenerational responsibility. People are worried about the fact that their children may not be as well off as they are today. And they are looking at who is therefore offering them a better future, not just for them, but only for the next generations, not for the next election, not for the next parliament, but also, for their children and grandchildren.
Would you say France is an example of what you've just said? Because let's face it, with the policies that Macron, very, very shrewdly in the sense of the policies that the president has introduced, we will expect to see growth, but there could be some downturn, but it's coming at the same time as the rest of Europe's picking up speed in a way that it will mask the worst effects of some of the austerity measures.
Macron is a breath of fresh air in Europe, just like the fact that Madame Merkel has now achieved an understanding with the socialists, and that we can have a stable government in Germany. We will know soon which government the voters will choose in Italy. That's on the 4th of March. I told you already, the Dutch took 7 months in order to form a government. The Spanish had 1 year of interim government, and now, of course, they have other issues. So the question is, we are struggling with democracy. We're looking at the different ways, at the different forms in which we can make it better.
Just a minute.
But nevertheless, I believe getting there in the end.
Just a minute. The voters in Germany rejected the Grand Coalition by both Merkel and her previous partner from the SPD losing ground in the election, heavily losing ground in the election, only to find out that they've got exactly the same composition of government after the negotiations of the Grand Coalition. So the voters in Germany may well say, well, hang on a second, what did we vote for? We've got exactly the same government that we didn't want when we went to the government polls the last time.
What they did was to vote for different parties, and then, of course, in a democracy, in a parliamentary democracy like most of the Europeans, what they do, this is different from the presidential democracy in a country like the United States or my country, Mexico. What they did in the case of Germany is the 2 parties that could form a majority are again forming a coalition that will be democratic because it represents most of the voters, and therefore They are forming a platform which today is going to be a different platform, by the way, than the one they had with the coalition before. So, in a way, they are responding to the democratic call of the voters, which told them a different story this time than they were told last time.
This part of the world, are you optimistic?
Of course I'm optimistic, and I'm optimistic because what we see are countries that are planning for the post-oil era. There are countries that are planning for the post-gas era. There are countries that are becoming more open, more democratic, where women are having a more important role. You just can see all the ministers, the lady ministers that we've been talking to over here. You can see the universities that are being formed. You can see the fact that people are counting more and more and more. They're opening not just to the world, but opening to themselves. Democracy is advancing. So yes, this is a very exciting part of the world. It is growing. It has its own contradictions, its own problems, its own cultural issues.
What does it need to do?
Even security issues. But of course, those are the ones, those are the challenges that we have to work on.
What do government need to do? And I know that's a broad brush, different governments, but let's take, for example, the current dispute within the Gulf countries here at the moment. You know, what do governments need to do to ensure that they don't destroy their own economic success, in a sense, with either political or factional regional issues?
First of all, need a lot of wisdom, and this is where multilateralism comes in. This is where multilateralism will go beyond the short-termism and the single view of a particular country that is looking according to its own interest. But also, these societies need to go back to the fundamentals, to education, to innovation, to regulation, to competition, to the labor markets, to the product markets, to the universities, to the financial systems, to the R&D. These are the kinds of things that are going to make the recovery durable, that are going to make it sustainable over time, and that are going to make societies evolve in a way which will be harmonious.
How do you do that, as we're coming towards the end, how do you do that without bringing the house down round your head?
Well, the question is that this idea that if we open up and become more democratic, then governments will fall, I think is outdated. It's a false dilemma. In fact, by becoming more and more democratic, what you do is that you maintain the interest of people, you maintain the stake of people, the ownership of people in a democratic process, and that ownership is going to make for everybody to be interested in stability. But that does not mean that the same governments have to be staying on and on and on. It just makes for orderly transition according to what the people want.
How long have you been head of the OECD?
11.5 years.
Really?
Yes. I have been voted, elected 3 times now. So
how long are you going to stay?
No problem with democracy. My mandate now finishes on June of 2021, and I have a perception that that may be the end of it.
No! Do we want him to go? No! Finally, you've got 30 seconds to tell us, why do you keep going on this? Dull, economics, dusty, productivity. What is it that keeps you going for 11.5 years doing this?
Better policies for better lives. If it's not about better lives, then it's not worth it. Thank you very much.
Ángel Gurría.